Okay, hello everybody. We're back here with Science of Spirituality, where we talk about the newest research going on in uh, spirituality, very broadly construed. And we're here today with Alex Belser, who's a researcher at NYU, a co-founder of the psilocybin project at NYU, and a PhD candidate there. Hey, Alex, welcome.
Hi, David. Thanks for having me. I appreciate that.
Yeah, so you are an expert in qualitative analysis. And so one of the things that you've been doing is looking at interview transcripts of people who have just undergone a psilocybin session,
That's right. Yeah.
these psilocybin sessions seem to have something uh, very intimately to do with spiritual experiences. So could you talk about the psilocybin work that you're doing at NYU, first of all?
Yeah, absolutely. So, about 2006, it started looking like in the United States that we could start once again doing research with psychedelic medicines like psilocybin. And at NYU, we decided to start a study to treat people who had cancer, advanced cancer, life-threatening cancer, or recurring cancers, and a lot of clinical anxiety about their cancer. With a combination treatment of psychotherapy and a dosing session with psilocybin, which is the active compound in what are sometimes called mushrooms or magic mushrooms. And we've just now completed that study and are working on our findings, getting those published. But what's exciting about it is that, um, in our study, about two-thirds, 68% of our participants, of our cancer patient participants said that the experience they had was among the top five most spiritually significant of their lives. And that's really profound. I mean, that puts it
Yeah.
on par with the death of a child, or excuse me, the death of a parent, or goodness, or the birth of a child. It's a major life experience. And
So,
we
so
also,
let me just pause you there. So when you have these people in the lab
yeah,
and they've been educated a little bit about what to expect, but they're essentially sitting in a psychology lab room at NYU. You're administering this psilocybin, and what you're saying is that these people, these participants, are saying that this experience that lasts just a few hours is one of the top five most meaningful and spiritually significant experiences of their entire lives.
right.
So that's incredible, and there's research at Johns Hopkins showing this as well. So you're replicating these findings and extending them in a new population. Is that right?
That's right. We're replicating some of the findings that the amazing work that the Johns Hopkins team has been working on. And at NYU, our primary investigator, Steve Ross, and my colleagues, Jeffrey Gus and Tony Bossis, have really helped to take us to figure out how clinically we can help people who have cancer and have a lot of clinical anxiety and depression because of a debilitating illness in their life that threatens death, asks us to really address the deepest questions of what it means to be alive, what it means to be ill, what it means to be separated from other people in our lives, and how we can help treat people with these struggling in these life circumstances.
That's
So,
fascinating. So
yeah.
there's not a lot of tools available, I would imagine, to physicians or psychotherapists at the end of life. Um, we're looking at some things in hospice and chaplaincy, and of course there are painkillers and things like that. But it sounds like what your work is doing is providing potentially a new tool um, that helps people deal with their circumstances. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, I mean, David, as you and probably many people watching this know, in the United States, one of the most avoided conversations in medicine is the last conversation you may have with your doctor about what it means, how you want to die, what it means to have a good death. And
Sure.
people, we avoid that conversation to the detriment of our health and well-being. People die in hospitals under circumstances that they would not have wished for themselves, oftentimes without the dignity that they might have had if we had considered it more properly. And they also have a lot of poor medical outcomes, not only because of this, but poor psychological outcomes like anxiety and depression that are affiliated with the death and dying processes. So what's interesting about this treatment is that it combines a supportive psychotherapy over the course of 9 months with a dedicated therapist with this novel compound, psilocybin. And you don't see effects like we're seeing with antidepressants or other conventionally approved FDA pharmacological interventions. So as a researcher, I mean, as somebody who's in the field, it's really curious. It raises more questions than it answers at this point. And so what is motivating to me is to ask, okay, what is going on? What exactly is happening in the treatment room? What is the inner experience of the person who's receiving this medicine? And what implications does it have in their lived experience in their life? How do they make sense of it? I mean, what's really going on is what we're asking.
Yeah, that's really profound. And there are a number of questions to ask here. What's going on the neurobiological level, the neurotransmitter level, psychologically, phenomenologically, and we'll get into some of that with your qualitative work in a moment. But I just want to remark on, I was looking at some of the effect sizes from the Hopkins research, and it's really remarkable because we don't deal typically in psychology with these massive effect sizes. Of course, there's a replicability crisis, and we talk a lot about that. And oftentimes in psychology, we're looking at very nuanced, small differences. But these experiences seem to be incredibly profound, and their effects on people, as you said, seem to be similarly profound.
Yeah, we have a forthcoming paper written by Steve Ross and the rest of the team at NYU, and our effect sizes. I mean, basically, the primary things that we're measuring in the quantitative study, where you give people standard measures, are standard measures of anxiety and depression, like the Beck Depression Inventory, for example, and the hospital anxiety and depression scale. And when you say effect size, is just what that means is most interventions in psychology, when you go to see a talk therapist or if you give somebody an antidepressant, you'll see small to medium effect sizes. What we're looking at here, all of our effect sizes in this initial, obviously it's a phase 2 study, it's not a massive study, there's only 31 participants. But what we're seeing are effect sizes that are all greater than 1 and up to 1.7, which are, if you're a statistician, these are numbers that get you really excited because you do not see psychological interventions with this powerful a shift in the average scores, people's average scores on these anxiety and depression scales going down, dropping precipitously, and staying down not only after 6 weeks follow-up, but over the long course at 6 months.
That's fascinating, and we'll probably have someone on to talk more about what's going on the neurobiological level with these pharmacological interventions. But I'm interested in talking to you a little bit about that one measure where participants were asked how spiritually significant was this event. And the more I talk about the nature of spirituality and trying to study it through these conversations on this show, the less I understand what spirituality is. And I'm guessing that this maybe was something that you were looking to answer. So you asked participants how spiritually significant was this event, and that was sort of a multiple choice question, right? They could rate their degree of agreement from a scale of 1 to 10 or whatever it was. Right. But you also did in-depth interviews. So could you talk a little bit about what that process was like?
Yeah, that's right. When you have a new treatment and you're dealing with a new medicine, there are some effects in the brain. We know it's active at the 5-HT2A and 2C receptor sites, and we know that it looks a little bit like serotonin, the molecule psilocybin. But these effects, we would expect that to have an effect after 24 hours or maybe 2 days. But they persist. They last weeks and months. So we think that something's happening that's really a psychological mechanism of action. What I mean by that is that people go through this treatment, something happens, there's a black box of experience. We also administer a mystical experience questionnaire. And so the leading sort of...
And what kind of questions would be on there, on the mystical experience questionnaire?
Yeah, they'd ask questions about the degree to which you felt a oneness of the self with the universe, a degree of connectedness with all things, a sense of ineffability, and being unable to articulate what it is that you're experiencing. So sort of classical, what you might imagine classically, somebody experiencing a mystical or profoundly religious or spiritual experience.
And sort of based on William James's original conceptualization, right? And,
that's right.
Yeah.
Right.
Great.
Father of psychology, William James. That's right. So we did interviews. And the point of a qualitative inquiry is that you don't really have a specific hypothesis. So you're not saying, it's not a hypothesis testing mode of research. It's really a hypothesis generating mode of research, because you ask people about their experience and then you come up with these interesting ideas. Now, the dominant positive theory in the field, I mean, it's a new field in psychedelic research, is that people experience, they go through the treatment, they experience a profound mystical or mystical type experience, and then they have good effects. They have better quality of life, fewer symptoms, that sort of thing.
And those are quantitative measures.
Those are quantitative measures.
So maybe we should differentiate. Just there's the quantitative and there's the qualitative, and they're both forms of empirical research, that is through observation. So do you mind making that differentiation for the listeners? What quantitative versus qualitative research is?
Sure. So, quantitative research will use scores on things like surveys or questionnaires or people's blood pressure readings, right? Think hard numbers where you can do very specific statistical tests between two groups to determine if there's a statistically significant difference. With qualitative experience, we're more interested in asking, humanistic questions and clinical questions based upon the person's lived experience. So we ask questions like, can you tell me what happened to you when you were in the room? What was your experience of it? What did it mean to you? What feelings arose for you? What people did you think of or were connected in your experience? Did you have any insights? If so, what were they? Since you finished this treatment, and now that you are back in the world at your job and with your family and on the subway, what's the effect on your life? Has it had any effect on your life? And if so, how would you describe that? And so you end up with what are really thick, nuanced, what are called in qualitative research thick, meaningful experiences that are difficult necessarily to parse, but that you may see themes that arise that are emergent across multiple cases. So if you interview a dozen people, which is what we did in this study, you find that, well, actually there are some universal experiences across these cases of different people. And we found some things that were really fascinating. So I can share them with you.
Yeah, no, I'm, like we said before we started, I haven't heard these findings yet, so I'm really fascinated to hear what you have to say.
So, some of the things, I want to focus on the things that were a little unexpected. Some of the things that were expected that we found was that people had really meaningful visual phenomena. They saw things both in the room and in their closed eye experiences that were really profound and beautiful. They saw ocean visages and cloud visages. People had received lessons, spiritual lessons, or what we called wisdom lessons. And many of them reported that they actually 13 of 13 people said they've changed their life priorities since being a participant in this study, that they've actually shifted the way they value different activities in their life, which is really fascinating. And of our participants, 12 of the 13 people that I interviewed said that they would they would like to repeat the experience.
Wow.
So they thought it was worth doing. The first time around, everybody did, and nearly everybody, all but one person, said they'd like to do it again. And you don't usually see that in clinical interventions. Usually
That's really interesting. That brings up a point, I think, that comes with this territory typically, which is the idea of the bad trip. And so did you see evidence for that in this group, at least?
We did, and we have a paper coming out, if anyone's interested in reading about that. We have a whole section on what our interpretive team, our research team, has been called difficult experiences or bad trips, or in sort of spiritual language, like the dark night of the soul, ego death, or ego disintegration experiences. These are experiences that people have that cause transient distress. They're really anxious. They may feel scared. And it's important for me to underline that the entire design of our trial, really in a deep way, we intended to create a space, a clinical space, where they trusted and knew the two people who were in the room with them, the therapists, that they were in a beautiful setting. They weren't at a concert or on the street. They were in a beautiful spa-like environment with a couch and flowers and natural objects. So they had space and ease and comfort to support them through what may be a difficult experience.
And this is called traditionally set and setting, right? Kind of preparing people with the right mindset and then creating a safe space for that experience. Is that right?
That's right. We do everything in our power to provide a supportive and safe milieu, a proper mindset and a good setting for them to have their experience in. And our finding with the qualitative study is that when people reported difficult experiences, or what have been called bad trips, it's not just a singular moment, right? It's actually a trajectory, a progression, a going down into difficult, even sometimes like profoundly panic-inducing experiences. People don't know where they are or who they are. They're lost, they're confused and scared. And they may be accessing memories. They may be accessing past traumas in their life. They may be accessing parts of themselves that they may not normally have access to in the regular, normal, everyday consciousness. And with the support of the team and with the support of the treatment setting, they go down and they come to some resolution. They come through that, generally through that experience, into a place of deep emotional catharsis. We have we had one participant who hadn't cried since he was 6 years old.
Wow.
And he's a young man in his early 20s, and he just wept profoundly for the first time in nearly 2 decades. And it had a real, in the Greek sense, a catharsis, a release of pent-up distress material.
And so in that case, that sounds like as you say, a difficult experience. Some people might even say, that looks like a bad trip during it, but what was the outcome? And are there sometimes difficult experiences that, even though they're difficult in the moment, end up having a positive outcome?
We found that all of our experiences resulted within the treatment session itself in a positive outcome, a profound sense of relief, a feelings of joy, bliss, the release of profound built tension. In our study, 11 out of the 13 people I interviewed experienced a feeling of deep love. Another 11 experienced a feeling of profound joy. And so you have difficult experiences that are adequately resolved. And that's hard to do.
Yeah.
Both for the person and for the people who are there supporting their work. But it's important to create that space.
So in this sample, you found 100% of the people said that their experience was positive?
That's right. We found that people who had difficult experiences, we had one person who worked in the integration psychotherapy sessions in the couple weeks following her session, but it led to a profound... Well, in that experience, she remembered some some trauma that she had experienced, sexual trauma in her youth and her family. And in the few weeks and even few months after that, she's an adult woman in later life now. It initiated a conversation. She initiated a conversation that she had never had with her grown daughter about the experiences that she had when she was a young girl that were quite were sexually traumatic and repressed. And through this study and through the support of and a lot of intention, she was able to have that conversation again. So it's difficult work,
yes,
but it's also work worth doing, I think, for many of our patients.
That's really interesting. And that raises the question. I mean, a lot of people are using these substances outside of this kind of controlled set and setting, the safe space, this sort of therapeutic milieu. And it seems as if there would be a higher probability for negative experiences if the substance is taken outside of these kinds of controlled settings. And yet, and this brings up our paper that we wrote together, which looks at just mystical experiences experienced in the normal population. I think it's about 900 people or something, a pretty decent sample, and I think that we expected to find that psychedelic experiences wouldn't necessarily be as positive as spontaneous experiences, but we found, in fact, that overall, psychedelically induced mystical experiences were rated as more impactful and more positive. Was that surprising for you?
It was surprising because it goes back to this old question, right? Like maybe that we might ask ourselves, what is a real spiritual experience? What is an authentic, genuine mystical experience? Two people come into a room. How is Solomon to determine who's the true mystic from the one who's faking it, right? And how did they get to that experience? Did it take 40 years of meditation? Was it through some sort of penance? Was it through fasting? Was it through ecstatic dance? Was it through the treatment using eating a mushroom? And it's a very difficult question. And it's a question that William James sort of asks in his Varieties of Religious Experience, in his book, and also William Stace, a philosopher in the early 60s. And so the study that you spearheaded, David, is fascinating to me. It's really fascinating because it takes a large sample of people and says, well, did you have a profound religious, spiritual, mystical experience? And about half of them said, and these people did, and about half of them said that experience was associated with taking a psychedelic drug,
yeah.
And about half of them said it wasn't. And then we were able to compare scores on quality of life and religious score on the mystical experience questionnaire. And our, these participants who took psychedelics reported a reduced fear of death. They reported an increased sense of purpose in their lives and an increased level of spirituality in their lives, far more so than people whose experiences were not associated with psychedelic substances. And so that again raises more questions than it really answers.
Really interesting. So do you have a kind of public statement that you make your team as you're presenting these findings? I imagine you typically get this question from someone in the audience saying, well, should we all just go out and take psilocybin now? Do you have a statement that you make in these kinds of public settings?
Yeah, we don't have a common disclaimer or anything, but I would argue, and I think that the rest of our team is of the opinion that all of the research that we're doing is in a setting with people who are, but first of all, licensed therapists and psychiatrists and doctors. The environment has been physically designed to be safe and supportive. And our participants in the interview study repeatedly underscored how important it was for them when they were on the couch in the midst of their experience, even those potentially difficult time periods, that they knew that they were in a safe and held space. And I think that while it may be conceivable that those spaces can be intentionally created in the desert or at a concert or in nature or in somebody's house, it's much more difficult to do that because you don't have the protection of first of all, you don't have the legal protection in the United States, and you don't have the experienced and guiding hand of a team that is really, has been studying how to proceed with this. So we don't encourage people to take a drug off the street because we don't think that that's really an optimal setting at this point.
Good, yeah. That seems like it's a useful disclaimer to put out there when talking about this kind of research. So on the other side, on the marijuana legalization has occurred or picked up at a pretty rapid pace. Do you think it's plausible that within 10 years, if you're pronounced terminally ill, a psychiatrist will be able to write a script and prescribe a psilocybin session? Do you think that's possible?
I think you might have to extend your timeline a little bit.
Okay.
But I have to say a lot has happened just in the last 10 years that I've been involved in this area. And who knows what may happen by 2026. There is a growing body of research evidence in peer-reviewed medical and scientific journals suggesting that psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy is clinically beneficial for people with anxiety due to cancer, who are trying to quit smoking. We're starting a study at NYU for people who have treatment-resistant alcoholism, people who really have been trying to stop drinking but have a difficult time doing that.
Wow.
And so there's a large and growing research evidence base. And we hope that the sort of backdrop of the last 50 years of the war on drugs, which has largely not been informed by scientific research, will not stand in the way of a clear and discerning evaluation of the evidence regarding whether it makes sense to consider rescheduling these substances. Now, that's up to the DEA, the FDA, and public policy makers. But at this point, we're trying to do the basic science to inform those practices and decisions.
It'd be nice for science to inform more public policy, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the Controlled Substances Act, signed by Nixon into law, occurred during a very difficult and different time in our nation's history, and those laws are still in the books, so it may be time to think about them.
Yeah. Now, last thing, so getting back around to the notion of spirituality, did interviewing your participants give you any insight into what they meant by spirituality, what spirituality meant to them?
I'm glad you asked, because I wanted to get back to something, and you've brought it up. So the leading thinking about spiritual experiences in psychedelic practice at Hopkins and UCLA and NYU and other places in Europe where these studies are happening is that people have a spiritual experience and then they have beneficial clinical effects. When we asked people about this, though, this wasn't sort of like a disembodied. I mean, some people had a very sort of like meeting with God moment, but most people did not report some sort of Zen-like, I'm sitting on a mountaintop alone and I have a meeting with the Godhead, right? They're not having that sort of picture of what we might think of as a mystical experience. Instead, what we found when people told me was that their experiences were profoundly relational, right? They were deeply embedded in their attachment relationships with their husbands and wives, with their sons and daughters, with their mothers and fathers. And so they weren't alone on a single person on a mountaintop. They were in relationship in their vision experiences, in their memories, in their hopes, in their catharses, with people that they've loved and lost, people who sustain them, people who constitute themselves and their beings. And this shouldn't be a surprise. I mean, psychology in the last 50 years has moved towards understanding people in relation as social animals, in relationship to each other, through our deep attachment to one another as human beings and our attachment to our caregivers. and the people that we love. And what we found was that the spiritual experiences that people had were informed by love, were informed by love of each other, and in many instances, love of themselves as reflected through the eyes of people that they became close to in their lives.
That's really interesting. So if it sounds like what you're saying is in this study, the participants construed spirituality as deeply related to connection and a sense of love. Is that accurate?
That's right. They were relationally embedded. The way they made sense of their experience was not a solo journey, but rather a collective work.
And so what makes that spiritual? Why wouldn't they just say I felt connected to my family? Why wouldn't they construe that in terms of relationships? What makes that spiritual and not just feeling more connected? It's kind of a rhetorical question. I mean, I don't expect you to have an answer, but I'm curious.
Yeah. Remember the young 20-something man I introduced earlier who cried for the first time since he was 6. His crying had to do with the fact that he used to he had grown apart from his father. And this was a young man with testicular cancer who had really struggled, but he had grown apart from his father through his adolescence and early adulthood. And in the psilocybin session, he had an experience of feeling like life had meaning again, that he felt like a child of God again, because he was able to remember that his father liked to dream when he was young. And as a man, he had shut out his father, and he had shut out his father's hopes for his life. And there was some level of forgiveness in his story, forgiveness not only of his father, but forgiveness of his own actions, the things that he's regretted in his life and the way that he's moved away. And so, I don't know, maybe my understanding of spirituality is a little broad. I don't think that spirituality only happens in a church pew or on a zafu. I think that it happens when we hold the hands of the people that are in our lives, and people often experience that love and sense of sacredness in the presence of people that are dear to them.
Beautiful. Let's leave it there on that line. Alex, thanks so much for talking about your really interesting research and some of your forthcoming papers, which we'll post for people to look at. And best of luck. I'll talk to you soon.
David, thanks for having me. It's lovely talking with you.